in early July. And basically the way Tezos on-chain governance works is that it allows the stakeholders to come to consensus not just about state, but also about protocol upgrades. And so protocol upgrades, it's typically you want to change the transaction. If you want to change block size, if you want to change block time, these sorts of things. But it's also if you want to change the consensus mechanism itself, if you want to change the governance model itself, you can do all those things in Tezos. The way it works is there's sort of several cycles of voting. The first cycle is sort of like deciding on what upgrade we want to move to, and so then that you have to meet a quorum of 60%, and then that goes to a test net. And then from there, it's based on a predefined amount of time, it's then moved onto mainnet. A new vote to decide whether to move it onto mainnet, and then that's another 60% of the quorum amount votes to approve it. So at a minimum, it's about like 36% of the network can approve a protocol upgrade. Which is like pretty important in a decentralized network. It's pretty hard to get people to coordinate. So, but the underlying sort of motivation for Tezos is this idea that you want to keep the network decentralized, and you want to make sure that governance is decentralized. But you also want to make sure that you're keeping a pace with innovation, right? And you also want to make sure that you can maintain the network effects, because at the end of the day, these things are money. At least at the core protocol level, they're money. And money's value comes almost entirely from Metcalfe's law. So the idea is that you look at even things like Bitcoin or other protocols that aren't necessarily keeping pace with innovation, but there's still so much value in it just because of the network effect that it can maintain. And so Tezos is trying to sort of like, okay, let's keep that network effect, let's stay decentralized, but we also want to be able to keep a pace with innovation. And we also implement ways of sort of making it easier for people to evaluate the quality of proposals, and as well as sort of make it easy for people to easily audit proposals. And in the future, we want to move away from voting entirely. Well, we want to move away from entire reliance on voting. So we want to move towards a hybrid model that uses both prediction markets and voting to approve, so the prediction market creates like, this focal point that everyone sort of agrees everyone else will want to be on. And then everyone would then vote to approve it as a check on, whether or not it's actually a good idea, because, sometimes prediction markets can go awry, as we've been seeing recently. But the end game is hopefully, a project that stays decentralized, at the governance level, but also, keeps pace with innovation. Thanks.
Thank you. Up next we have Adrian Brink from Cosmos.
Hello, I'm Adrian. Nice to meet you. So I work on Cosmos. Cosmos, very quickly, give like a 30-second pitch, 30-second overview. It's building the Internet of blockchains. So our thesis is that it's in the near future, it's all about having hundreds, if not thousands, of independent state machines that may or may not have shared or non-shared or so sovereign security models. So either they're all secured by the same validator set, or some are secured by their own validator set. And the idea is, how do we make them all interoperable, right? That's the coolest feature about, for example, Ethereum, is that everything just works with each other. And so our notion is, how do we make it very easy to build multiple independent blockchains, and then also how do we enable multiple independent blockchains to connect with each other and talk to each other. So that's a protocol called IBC, inter-blockchain communication. It's simply a notion of how do we pass authenticated data transfers or value, it really doesn't matter in this context, between independent consensus systems. So we have blockchain A and we have blockchain B, and ideally I want to be able as a user to send a message on blockchain A that locks up some tokens against the consensus set of blockchain B, and that message then gets relayed, and on blockchain B, I know that given such a message, I will then receive money, like the token on blockchain B. Because this enables all sorts of cool applications. For example, instead of having to build a DEX on Ethereum where all the tokens are right now, you have to build in the BVM, you can say, I really like Go or I like Rust or I like Haskell. you build your independent state machine in Go, Rust, or Haskell, and then you say, awesome, there are all these other tokens in like Bitcoin, Zcash, Ethereum, and now I can just connect them all to my chain, and now, or to my DEX chain, and now the DEX has the full capabilities of building your own state machine, so you're not constricted to something, and yet you still are able to interact with everyone else. So that's like sort of a quick overview. Internet of blockchains, it's all about interoperability. In order to make this work, we also need fast finality consensus. So we've built something called Tenement Consensus in an instantiation called Tenement Core, which gives you, which is a PBFT algorithm that gives you instant finality. So within a single block, your finality, which is sort of a requirement. You need a finality consensus algorithm to make IBC work. In terms of our governance model is very straightforward. Yes, it's just very straightforward. It's only bonded token holders get to vote. You have multiple vote types. You can vote yes, no, abstain, or no with veto. If more than a third vote no with veto, then it just halts this single vote under the notion that if a third of your population really dislikes something, there's probably a point in not doing it and talking more about it. Like, you don't want votes to be coin flips, essentially. Like, where more than a third feels very strongly about not doing it. Besides that, it's simple majority governance, so it's like 51% to accept, to get a proposal accepted. And then the upgrade path, it's not happening on-chain because, like, so we were as cautious as possible. It's like not on-chain, nothing automatic. People essentially vote on-chain, say we want to run this, like we want to implement this feature, and someone builds it. Then we can all start upgrading our nodes eventually in the future. If we have maybe another governance votes on like when exactly we want to upgrade to this. Yeah, that's like, because we really don't know how governance will evolve, so we're going to start simple. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, and up next we have Igor from POA Network.
Hi guys, my name is Igor. I'm from POA. So POA is an immediately available scalability solution for Ethereum ecosystem. So it's a sidechain based on parity code base with different civil control mechanism, which we call proof of authority with identity at stake. So this is a public network available since December 2017, and it's all built based on governance model. Because when you start permissioned network with public consensus, one of the main questions is, who are your authorities, who are validators, how validators added or removed from the network, how they selected, and how can independent token holders prove that this consensus is working as it's designed. Right. So we have multiple steps to bootstrap this type of network. It all starts from a trusted ceremony, where a special role, which we call master of ceremonies, create first initial keys, which cannot be used for anything but only for exchanging this key by individual validators to a new set of keys. And this master of ceremonies distribute these keys to validators with specific parameters. We decided to use validators as individuals, so they are all US-based validators with staked identities. So it means that they're all KYC with no previous criminal record, fingerprinted by their state, and their identity is available on the website of state where they reside. So we use some existing state-level registration of individuals to achieve this type of confidence in individual validators. And after this ceremony is completed, validators have on-chain self-governance, so they can add or remove validators from the network. Our concern was, is it working or not? And now we can see that validators added from 12 to 21 validators, and the network continues to grow. And this model is easily scalable both vertically, so validators can decide to increase parameters of these nodes, and horizontally, so they can make new networks based on the same consensus with different set of validators. And also we have independent tools where any concerned third party can check how validators participate in ballots. They can subscribe to governance events. Basically this creates the possibility to run this network. This network is two-way pegged to Ethereum network, used modified parity bridge, and both native and pegged tokens available on exchanges. So this is the first two-way pegged blockchain in public space, and yeah, so it's all about governance. Without governance, it's not possible to create this type of model. And just like one last thing, in April 1st post by Vitalik on April's Fool's Day, 2 years ago, he said that Ethereum mainnet is going to migrate to proof of authority consensus as a joke, right? And now we can see that this type of consensus can operate in public space and interesting to applications. And we understand that there are better scalability solutions in future, but not many immediately available scalability solutions we have now. And POA is one of these solutions. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you. And up next we have Gavin Wood from Polkadot Network.
Just out of interest, who already knows what Polkadot is? Do I need to give an intro to that? Put your hands up if you don't know what Polkadot is. Too few, ask me afterwards. Okay, so what I want to tell you about is what sort of features we built in for governance and roughly how governance sort of we see it working. 1 second. Okay, cool. Right, now Polkadot's based around a technology called WebAssembly. Who's heard of WebAssembly? Yeah, everybody. Okay, cool. WebAssembly is a very, very simple VM definition, basically. It's like, I don't know, 30 instructions. If you get rid of the floating point ones, it's like super duper simple, super duper basic, can be used for anything. People have done all sorts of crazy, wacky shit in it, like 8-bit and 16-bit emulators. You can play them on the web, it's great. We're going to use it for describing how blockchain works. So the Polkadot blockchain is actually based upon a lower level bit of technology called parity substrate. Now parity substrate is basically just some networking to talk to other peers, some logic for synchronizing some code, some logic to form a consensus over which block should be considered the canonical, finalized next block head of chain, and a WebAssembly interpreter. The WebAssembly interpreter is there to say what the next block, whether the next block is indeed valid or whether it's not valid. So actually it only really defines one function. For those of you who are sort of into blockchain and architecture, it's the execute block function, right? So it's this kind of super low-level, all-encompassing function that basically says, here's a block, tell me what the fuck it means, right? And that also means these are some transactions in the block, tell me what they do. Now this is kind of different to some of the other projects. So for example, with Tezos, the idea is that the entire executable can be moved out when the upgrade happens, when governance decides that something should change. That's not the case with Substrate, with Polkadot. We're actually only changing the logic of the blockchain, the nature of the blockchain, the thing that changes, the thing that makes Bitcoin and Ethereum different, right? They both have the same consensus mechanism, they're very similar peering mechanisms, but actually the key difference is what the transactions mean, or the state transition function if you're into the technical side. So we allow that to be changed because it's defined in WebAssembly. So then the question is, how can it be changed? Damn it. Let me get this back up again. Now, we believe in coin hodlers and empowering coin hodlers. So we have, this is like a rough diagram of how things work. You see the coin hodlers at the bottom there, right? So these are kind of the Polkadot token owners. And there are basically two ways that new stuff can get into Polkadot, that Polkadot can change and evolve and move with the times, which we think is, by the way, very, very important. And one of them is that they can table a motion, they can propose a motion. I propose that we change the blockchain from being the current Polkadot blockchain to this new, amazing, featuresome, awesome Polkadot blockchain. Great, fine. They're publicly proposed motions. They go into a queue, people can back them, they can throw extra dots behind them, and every now and again, every 2 weeks or so, the thing at the top of the queue, the thing with the most dots saying, hey, this is a good motion, I want it to come to pass, I want to see a referendum on it. That moves into the table motions and it becomes a referendum, people can vote on it. Now we have a voting mechanism that basically means it's kind of like majority carries, but we actually also give a bonus to the minority if it's from the coin hodlers, because we think, well, you know, unwashed masses, might be some dodgy stuff coming in there. So we force either a high turnout, or we force the positive votes, the I votes, the votes for change, to be substantially greater than the negative votes. The other way of getting a referendum in is via the council. The council is an elected body, elected through approval voting with a staggered seats. So basically, every now and again, one seat comes up for vote, and there's a bunch of all the coin holders can vote for it. And it's an approval vote, so it's not first past the post. You can choose as many of them as you want to vote for. It's the one with the most aggregate votes. They get in. The runners-up get to keep their votes, which means it's really unlikely that there won't be some degree of churn of different people coming in as the free seats go round in a circuit. Now, unlike some of the other projects, we actually believe that you've got to put your neck on the line. I mean, this is we've done this a few times in the past. We haven't always been successful in it, but we still believe that you can't play it safe with everything. And Polkadot is, again, one of the technologies where we're willing to actually be the innovators in the space. And in this case, we do want to have absolutely binding on-chain governance. So Polkadot is actually a meta protocol. It's a protocol that governs how the real protocol, the protocol of Polkadot, changes over time. And this governance mechanism is part of that sort of protocol. And the meta protocol is the thing that kind of says, right, the governance mechanism has decided that the protocol needs to change. So we're going to change it. And that happens on-chain with consensus logic. There's no way of getting around it. You can't sort of, as a miner or as a full node, decide not to upgrade as you can in Ethereum, or as you will be able to in the Cosmos take on things. This is very much more like the Tezos worldview, where it's like, no, governance is on-chain and it should be binding. The thing that happens on-chain should be binding, and we believe it should be too. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have Jack DeRose from Calamity.
Thanks very much. Hello everyone, I'm Jack from Calamity, and we are an Ethereum-based project building tools for the governance of decentralized organizations and applications. So I'll try and keep it really super brief so we can get into the panel where I think we'll get into some of the juicier stuff. We are building both a protocol and a sort of fully decentralized application, enabling both developers to build new kinds of decentralized organizations, decentralized applications, and also for new organizations which are not necessarily starting off with the intention of being a sort of DApp-based thing to be created. So new types of DAOs, new types of open organizations more generally. And so I suppose, just to cut to the quick, we're sort of contrarian in two important ways in comparison to the majority of other sort of decentralized governance approaches that you'll hear of. So the first is that we generally think that voting is a really bad idea and something that should be avoided wherever possible. So in Colony, if a vote is taking place, it's usually because either something's gone wrong and there needs to be a dispute over it, or something's extremely urgent and needs to be happening sort of relatively quickly. The second is that if a vote is taking place, then the authority, the influence, should not be derived by wealth. So that generally token holding is a poor proxy for expertise, And so we have Colony's reputation system. And a huge part of Colony, the way it's designed, is entirely to sort of meritocratically apply influence to individuals on the basis of the things that they've done, on the basis of the sort of empirical evidence that what they have done in the context of a given organization has been of quality in the eyes of their peers. And so we sort of permissively assign influence to those people's decisions, much in the same way as you would expect to happen in a sort of traditional organization. So it's trying to take the same principles of, that we've derived over many years of operating organizations at scale, and thinking how can we decentralize those efficiently. So should we get into the panel?
Yeah, thanks. It was really nice hearing all the different perspectives. Some little competition involved there. If anyone's tweeting this, by the way, hashtag is onchaingov. Sorry, I was a little late with that one. We're gonna have a panel after we have a quick break to get some pizza that just arrived here. So enjoy some pizza, and we'll be back here in about 15 minutes.
It's a little bit difficult because also I didn't know they were going to stand there now, and there was a guy sitting there. Yeah, but at least we'll try for this one.
in 2 minutes. 2 minutes we'll be starting. So if everyone can head back to their seats, in 2 minutes we'll be starting with the panel. Okay, we're gonna get the panel started right about now. Okay, so we can welcome everyone up to the panel. We can start with Adrian. Still waiting for Gavin and Jack.
Hello.
Alright, let's get started. So welcome back. Yeah, I'd like to just maybe start off with one word that gets associated with on-chain governance a lot is the term binding. And how necessary is that for your system, your model, and your vision for on-chain governance going forward? all of you. That makes sense. Is that,
You may have to turn that on.
okay, really, really, really important. Can you go a little elaborate into that a bit more?
Okay, so the thing is, governance without being bound by the result isn't really governance at all, right? So, for example, like Brexit, yeah? Now, you know, it's not my choice to leave the EU, but in some sense, it's a fair point by the Brexiteers that, you know, a referendum happened and the government really does need to abide by it. Now, obviously, there were a lot of problems with the referendum, not least the fact that it didn't require a supermajority, because the change from the default should generally require a supermajority if full turnout isn't required. But if it were just a signalling mechanism to say, hey, government, some of us would kind of like this. It's like, it's too easy for the government to say, yeah, but you're mistaken. And the equivalent for that on the blockchain is basically the miners or the full nodes or the validators or whoever else basically saying, well, we kind of hear you, and maybe we'll do it at some point, but kind of basically, we don't really care, The other problem with it being non-binding is if it's non-binding, there's no impetus for the proposal, for the proposition that people are voting on, to actually have any real detail. Until you know what it is that you're voting on, until it can be specified sufficiently well that it can be actually executed on automatically, then it's not really a proposal at all. It's just sort of a general vague direction. And that's, again, a problem with Brexit, and something that, good governance really should sort out.
So my take on binding proposals is more like nothing is really binding. Like, even if you have on-chain upgrades and everything, the people running the nodes can still coordinate off-chain and decide to run a different software. So even if you have automatic upgrades, there's always a way to unbind it. So there's you will never get full bindingness. It sort of depends a little bit on who the community ends up supporting, who the larger ecosystem ends up supporting. I think having with binding comes also on-chain upgrades, and I think on-chain upgrades are risky. They are very cool, but they're also risky because you are essentially committing to running arbitrary, any sort of software that gets proposed will end up being run. So, in the worst case, you're building extremely large botnets if you have automatic upgrades. And this is what almost happened to US, that they had an execution flaw where they could have upgraded to something that would have allowed people to circumvent governance and essentially force nodes to upgrade to a malicious software.
So if I can answer those 2 points. On the first point, at least with Polkadot, it is possible to create actually binding upgrades. I'll give you an example. Suppose there's 90% of voters decide to actually go with some particular upgrade path, some proposal. Now the full nodes, the validators, whoever, they all get together and they say, well, we don't like this. Maybe it's reducing the reward, or it's doing some other thing that sort of doesn't benefit them. So they say, right, well, we're not going to upgrade. So what do? Well, in principle, they can take the state transition, assuming that we have a binding system. They can take a state transition. So they can take a block where this thing actually changes things, and they would be getting fewer rewards. It would be disadvantaged. And they can refuse to execute it. They can change the result. They can say, we don't want to do this, and we're going to do a different block. But because you have a binding protocol, because the protocol actually binds this result, what they're doing is they're hard forking. They're forking away from the default. What that means is that they're creating a new network that the rest of the people will basically disregard. They'll all get slashed, and the rest of the people will carry on in the network that actually upholds the decision. Now, suppose, you say, well, they're the rich people, so they can just buy all of the other guy's stake, and they can take over the network, and they can attack it, and then everyone will ultimately come on to the one that didn't actually push the upgrade. Well, the problem with that is that that only works if they actually basically reduce the balance of all of the actual stakeholders, because all that will happen is those stakeholders will vote again for the equivalent proposal on the new forked network with their same balances, and it will pass again with their same balances. And so they're forever going to be fighting the will of the majority of the stakeholders. On the second point, actually, remind me what the second point was. What was the second point? Botnets. Yeah, so the botnets is a reasonable point. So back in the Ethereum days, we had this thing called the Yellow Paper Council. What the Yellow Paper Council was basically a contract on chain whereby it imposed some sort of governance. Now, the Parity Ethereum client uses this contract in order to decide whether it should upgrade itself. So the Parity Ethereum client's auto-upgrade mechanism actually is chain-based. So there's a governance mechanism that basically allows automatically changing protocols. So there's all sorts of things to do with hard forks and soft forks, and it's got all sorts of interesting safeguards. But you're absolutely right. If someone got hold of the keys or somehow forced in an upgrade that would be detrimental to the network, that perhaps injected an upgrade of parity of Ethereum that turned it into a big botnet, it would be a big problem, which is why for Polkadot we don't do absolute auto upgrades, we don't do software upgrades, we only upgrade the protocol component itself, which exists only within a WebAssembly interpreter, and thus avoid creating botnets just as sure as Ethereum smart contracts can't fuck around with your host machine.
Well, maybe botnets is the wrong word then, but if this ever fails, allows anyone to change any balance, right? Like, they may not be able to compromise the host, but they absolutely are able to compromise the network automatically. Yes, oh my god, this is scary. The old Ethereum clients have this.
Tezos has the same, right?
It's still a sandbox.
So it's a pretty similar picture in that regard. But I was going to make another comment about this matter of binding commitments in general, which is that if we sort of the vision, especially with Tezos specifically, but it also sounds like even Polkadot and other projects are thinking this way, is that it's like we kind of want these blockchains to be like autonomous institutions out there, that are sort of like independent of any central human control. And the idea that there's like, if you think about like what non-binding agreements sort of like who do they benefit? That's like always what we should be asking. It's like the people who typically want there to be like some kind of non-binding agreement are typically people who like believe that discretionary power is important for some critical reason, and there are arguments for discretionary power in a lot of contexts. But like if it's miners, if it's people who are like early token holders in a project in a protocol, if it's people who are on sort of the elite core dev team of a certain protocol that I won't name, they're very, very focused on their roadmap or their things that they've described in a discretionary way, and they want the space to work on these things on the timelines that they want to work on, as you're mentioning. So you have these conversations, and it's like, well, we can just like kick the can down the road on solving this problem that people have had. Maybe there's hundreds of millions of dollars locked up, but like we'll just like figure it out, and like we'll figure out how to solve it. Like this is not these sorts of problems are like real problems of like commitment, of getting people to sort of coordinate credibly. Like they require you to like really set a place where you're going to say like, okay, here is where we are, in a decentralized network, here is where we are going to say the rules end and discretion begins. And the question is like, which, if you're building a protocol, whether or not you think you want to be on like some point in that trade-off, and the place that Tezos and Polkadot and other projects put is like Tezos puts it like pretty far on the extreme end of that. It pushes the upgrades sort of automatically, right? And it sounds like in Polkadot it's sort of more limited a way of executing it. But like at the end of the day, like you have the things on the other end, which is like like this extreme hard fork world where you take all these upgrades you want to put that could have been done incrementally, but instead you're doing them all at the same time in a hard fork. that maybe something happens and then all of a sudden, snarks happen 6 months later because, you don't want to have to worry about, causing everyone to be, fail to coordinate around, have a consensus failure and fail to, go with your hard fork. So the point is, like, there's probably should be a diversity of, places that we draw that distinction in terms of rules versus discretion. But like right now, the discretion is winning to such a large extent that we definitely need like lots of experiments in pushing that further towards autonomous, sort of these autonomous networks.
Yes, the initial question was like described in one word, right? What is governance? So for me and for pure network governance is something that we maybe call it consensus itself, right? Because when you think about some abstract things like blockchain, right? Many people understand different things about on the same word. The same with governance. For us, it became a part of consensus. Without governance, we don't have it. I think that when I participated in this workshop and I heard different approaches to different projects, I understand that each project can get something out of it, right? And that's great that we have this type of collaboration, and our internal governance can be we can make it better by adopting practices from other projects.
So I think actually the initial question was, to what extent is it important that decisions are binding in governance in these kind of systems? And if we want to create things which are controlled by many people, which are commons in some sense, then it is impossible for them to not be binding. It has to be binding, otherwise it's really not decentralized.
That's right, Anna.
Yeah, I agree.
Consensus.
Cool. Yeah, and with that, many governance models that are coming out with on-chain governance are very, very, very adaptable, so the governance models themselves can change. And this is something, in a world without constitutions, are there places where this can go way too far without it, say it could be destroying itself by killing its own blockchain, or are there ways of safeguarding against these in forkless environments?
So Tezos is sort of one of the original projects that sort of looked at this question of like, okay, so governance determines the rate of change of a blockchain as improvement, or it affects the ability of it to maintain its network effect. Okay, and then the second question is like, well, long term, like maybe you can improve the rate. You can improve the rate of change. But what's even cooler is if you can affect the rate of change and affect acceleration, or improve acceleration. Or improve the ability of the governance model to improve network effects. And so the argument, that Tezos makes is that, basically, like, eventually a lot of governance models become stuck, or eventually, actually, like, you end up with gaming of the governance model, where people over time, they start to look at this governance model and they're sort of like, oh, like, I can start slowly forming this coalition. Nobody's maybe even going to notice that we're sort of forming this, space of preferences that is actually antithetical to the rest of the network. And you slowly build this coalition that opposes a certain change that would actually even maybe you would benefit all token holders, but in some way you're benefiting a smaller group or whatever. So the answer there is, you need to find a way, two things. You need to probably find a way to evaluate governance decisions, and that's actually something I've been thinking about personally is, what are some ways that go beyond price, that go beyond, market cap, all these sorts of sort of more raw metrics, and look at what are sort of some of the, who are the potential rent seekers and constantly keep a track of them. But also look at are people happy with how the protocol upgrade process went? Were they happy? Were developers happy with it? Were where token holders happy with it, where validators happy with it. Like you want to be able to see if all these key groups are actually aligned in supporting the upgrade. Because if you're doing things that, for example, maybe you're just starting to burn tokens, or you're doing something that maybe it pumps the price, but it doesn't necessarily make it a more valuable technology, and then in the long term you end up hurting the very same metric that maybe was helping someone in the short term or something. So things like that, I think we need to think about, like, what does it look like for us to have good governance at all? And then also, okay, how can we constantly try to improve the rule set, so that people who might be trying to game it, like, are at a disadvantage. And so Tezos wants to move to futarchy. We don't think that something like, and futarchy is where you use prediction markets to sort of have people have the decentralized network bet on you're basically creating a market in predicting which protocol upgrade or which decision would be one that enhances the metric that you've determined beforehand. So in blockchain protocols, the easiest one is always price, but there's also other things you could use, like transaction throughput, or things that are like pretty and that's sort of like maybe a little harder to disagree on because you can run on a testnet. But there's like other things that maybe like are welfare metrics, things that you could even create a basket of, or something like that you could run a prediction market on. So that's something that needs to be done carefully. It's not something we rush into, but it's something that we think at Tezos is something that we can use to augment what we can currently do with voting, and really sort of discourage gaming of the system, because it costs money to vote against, to say something, to say something that about a protocol. It's like, well, what about a protocol? Like, why didn't you make a lot of money shorting it on the prediction market?
Could you remind us of the question again?
How do you protect these adaptable governance systems from getting out of hand and doing maybe potentially destructive things to themselves?
I think fundamentally you can't. Like, governance is scary as hell. Like, governance is powerful but scary at the same time. By giving a community governance, a decentralized governance system that no one controls, you give that community full autonomy over the choices they want to make. If those choices are detrimental to them, that's not great, but that's the choice they've made. Like, the nice thing is that in these blockchain systems, you can always, in the worst case, you can like sort of restart. But fundamentally, I think with governance, we have to understand that giving governance a decentralized set of people is immensely powerful. And because these people can, theoretically, they're not constrained to making choices on the protocol itself or how the protocol works. They can decide to make choices on whatever they want. They can make choices on whether they should all move to one country, whether they should all stop buying a single product. And the nice thing is, it's like the community is very clearly delimited, so you know exactly who's in the community. And I think this will create very powerful systems, but at the same time, very scary systems.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems unlikely that you're going to get a blockchain that will enforce people's decision to all move to.
It's true, it's unlikely, but it's possible.
Move to Puerto Rico by Wednesday the 29th, or we will send the boys around to knock your music. Yeah, I mean, yeah. But it's a fair point that governance is pretty scary, and it's a problem that hasn't been solved, right? So we look around the world and we see many different governance systems because we don't know what the fuck one is actually good. They're all broken in different ways usually. Now what you can do is you can introduce checks and balances, so you can build on the shoulders of giants. You can have separate houses or subsets of actors whose job it is to keep the other subsets in line. Blockchains, indeed, really important point, do have a rewind button. That's great. Many computer systems do not have that. Blockchains do. And that helps, get out of jail free card when everything goes fucked. But I think beyond that, it's something that is going to need a lot of experimentation. So it's worth keeping in mind a lot of these defense mechanisms. It's worth putting in the defense mechanisms, and it's worth basically being open to saying, well, we're not going to find out what is a stable system until we've made a few errors and rewinded a bit, and we have some basic rule sets, some basic ideas about what doesn't get, what is stable, what doesn't get broken really fast.
So when you've got a protocol which is being managed by its users or its the people, its stakeholders in some sense, and they are the custodians, they're the developers almost of itself. It starts to look quite a lot like a company with a product, and most companies fail. Most companies have failures in the decisions that they make that cause them to go out of business. So I don't think there's any possible way to make a protocol immune from that happening. I think there's an inordinate amount of time and effort goes in when trying to design these protocols, given that you're generally trying to make them trustless, to prevent there being obvious ways for people to exploit other people. Obviously, that's a terrible thing to have happen. You always try and avoid that. But there is such a wide attack space when you're looking at a high degree of subjectivity being involved in decisions that can be made, that it seems like it's very difficult to avoid it entirely. So I think that the way to try and get to a position where we kind of get through this very sort of early period of understanding what on-chain governance even means is to have very robust ways of sort of big red buttons basically to say, oh shit, this has gone wrong. Let's try and fix that as quickly as possible. And so yeah, I think that there will be a lot of those kind of approaches which will be very beneficial.
So in Pure Network, when we designed our on-chain governance, we tried to make it as casual as possible for people who participate in this governance. So, for example, we limited who can participate in this governance. In POA, it's only validators can do this, right? And their tools are built for them, right? So they're UX and UI friendly. And also they have governance process every single week, right? So they have to decide on validators on both testnet and mainnet, and most of them vote in new validators, and well, sometimes they vote out validators for not following rules. So this process is casual, and it's hard to break because it's something that they doing on purpose and eventually for the good of the network. But there are there is a upgradability of this process. So validators can vote by supermajority to change rules of this on-chain governance. So for example, they can introduce a new form of voting. In POA, we described a model for self-sustainability. We think that most projects who raised funds on ICO eventually will run out of these funds, right? And after they will run out of tokens they pre-mined. So what to do next? We decided to embed a self-sustainability mission into the protocol, and from the second year of the network will create additional tokens. And these tokens will be accumulated for 3 months, and after validators can decide how to spend in which R&D team to spend these resources, or burn these resources, or hold them for 3 more months. This model exists in EOS, in Dash in some form, and some other blockchains. For validators, it will be an extreme form of governance, right? First of all, they need to make a hard fork to activate this, and after to make some new type of governance when they can basically break the network, right, or make a major failure for R&D team. And so that's why they have like 2 processes. One is like every week they vote in or vote out for validators on test and mainnet, and something extreme, and they prepare for this extreme governance events. So that's how we decided.
Yeah, so I'd just like to follow up with, while binding on-chain governance is certainly the wide unknown to which we've yet to figure out, it's worth remembering that the alternative is off-chain governance, which hasn't proven to be all that great so far. And I think in much the same way that when Bitcoin came along, the alternative to a fully autonomous, decentralized financial system was the existing meat space financial system. Some of us thought maybe it was worth a fucking jump in the dark, And the second point is, well, it may be off-chain governance is not so. There's not all that much to distinguish it from the difference between sort of off-chain smart contracts when Ethereum came around. So back in like early 2014, when we're still trying to get people around to the idea of smart contracts, everyone was like completely into Bitcoin. The biggest sort of thing I heard against the idea of Ethereum was, well, yeah, this hasn't been tried before and it's so much more powerful. What are you going to do to stop, everything just going wrong? And it seems to be a little bit of the same point with on-chain governance, with binding on-chain governance. It's like, this is like so powerful. You're introducing kind of a meta protocol, and then what we would normally have that's fixed and looked after by the core devs can be changed kind of in a decentralized manner by, the great hand from the sky. It's like, well, yeah, but, that's kind of why we're in this space. We kind of trust that if we put the right rules in place, then the great hand from the sky will generally make the right decisions.
Yeah, and speaking of off-chain governance, some of its proponents have often associated another word with on-chain governance called plutocracy. And this is something that just always comes up from anyone arguing against on-chain governance, and it's heavily associated with it. Do you think it's valid, this association, and if so, how are you fighting against that?
My response whenever people say that is like, I ask them like, do you know how much money Bitmain made last year? Like, do you know how much Vitalik and all these folks had, like in Joe Lubin, like whoever? It's like this is not like ruled by like peasants here. Like this is like an oligarchy, or as you can even call like an oligarchy. Like these are people who are in early and they like they control the net the future of the network. And the model is actually not that like it has its problems and it's hard for them to move to maybe an on-chain governance model. But I feel like the irony I've always observed here is that like exactly what Gavin is saying is that these are people who are like some of the best mechanism designers in the world. They have some of the best like understanding of trade-offs like in the world. And whenever you say like, oh, well, we think of it in terms of trade-offs and experimentation, they say like, oh, plutocracy. It's like, no, like it's a trade-off. Like we're trying to figure out like, if this experiment gives us a better side, whether that trade-off is worth it. And like, this is like this great, like I think we're gonna see some really interesting responses if this works, because they're going to say, I guess the next reply will be, well, it could degrade into a plutocracy pretty easily, or something like I think it's going to get watered down because these on-chain governance models are actually going to be pretty stable, probably, at least on some of them. One of them will be at least relatively stable for the first few upgrades potentially, and there could be a situation where the sort of the next just sort of going to be the next like moving the goalpost, but like what's the next thing that you want to sort of like point out about? Well, it's still a plutocracy. Like I don't know, it doesn't seem it doesn't seem like a sustainable approach to on-chain governance. If you're running an off-chain governance governance project.
I mean, it won't descend into plutocracy. It will be from the. Is it back? Yeah. It will be from the outset, right? So the question is whether that is because the plutocratic approach is a response to the civil problem that you can't. It's very hard to do something democratically because it's so trivial to create multiple identities, and even if you do have identities, it's pretty hard to ensure that people are only controlling one identity and they haven't bribed other people or them or coerced them in some way. So, I mean, even that actually applies with state-based voting as well, to be honest. But so the question is whether plutocracy is the only alternative, and I don't think it is. I think we have reputation-based decision-making within Colony, which it does come from having received tokens, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from having purchased tokens. So it doesn't need to come from having had wealth in the beginning. And I think that there's, the rationale behind that is that really wealth is no proxy for expertise, and depending on the granularity of the decisions that are being made within the context of a protocol or organization, it sort of determines the extent to which this is an issue. If you're making relatively large-scale decisions relatively infrequently, which are, broadly ratifying decisions that have already been made by people who are spending a lot of time thinking about these things, then it's probably not too bad. It's probably a perfectly reasonable way of governing a protocol. But if the kinds of decisions that are being made are far more granular, and in fact the governance of the protocol or organization that's trying to take place is more of a sort of operational basis, or a sort of managerial nature, than the sort of, I suppose, shareholder voting equivalent that we might expect of many protocol level governance processes, then I think it's far less clear that it's reasonable to weight people's decisions by how much money they have, or yeah, and that's our fundamental position.
So, can you hear me? Almost all democracies, almost all, are not very democratic. And there's a reason why. It's because the actual theoretical model of a democracy does not deliver a particularly nice place to live. So if you look at all the governance of tribes, they're not based around one head, one vote, they're based around elders. If you look at the UK, even in its democratic state at the moment, it's still not tremendously democratic. We have a first past the post for 600 odd constituencies, and it's those guys that supposedly make the decision until, of course, there's a referendum with a minority turnout. Even ancient Greece was not a one head, one vote place, right? And this is usually the typical place that's pointed out for a democracy that works. You had to be fairly minted. All of the slaves automatically didn't count. All the women automatically didn't count. We don't have better. We don't actually know what delivers a great society in terms of the governance mechanism, in terms of who gets to make the decisions. But one of the fallbacks that we have is, corporate governance, which is basically where the people that have the most to lose get to make the bigger decisions, right? And they kind of get to vote on it depending on how much they have to lose with it. And that's not a bad fallback position. Now, we can do a lot better than it, I'm sure, but one head, one vote is not a great place to start. Something else is, especially if the thing that they're meant to be deciding upon isn't a society, it's not somewhere, it's not like a village where everyone has to live, right? It's an economic system. It's a system that's designed, in some sense, to be a currency, to be valuable, to have security. We have relatively simple metrics for deciding how secure something is. And if one head, one vote says, well, I'm not so keen on security, but actually I would kind of like it to be, to give everyone some basic income or to do some other thing that's actually detrimental to the existence of the network itself, then you have a big problem. And that is probably, I would venture, you can disregard my opinion, but I would venture that's why certain societies that did give the one head, one vote method a try may not have succeeded so well.
Yeah, I like side chains, right? Side chains, usually they're a small network and it's easier to experiment than big networks or big ideas. When we designed PO network, we decided that security will cost 2.5% of initial supply. We just figure out inflation in the US and give this inflation within the network to a group of validators. They protect the network and they make all on-chain decisions, and they create only 2.5% of emission per year. So it's hard to call them oligarchs, right? Because most liquidity owned by token holders. And when we started to think, okay, how can we expand and experiment with sidechains even further? How we can create if you know model of hard spoons, when you can create a new sidechain and use part of emission of existing chain as an emission of this new sidechain. We figure out that it's possible to create very small shards with order of hundreds of thousands of dollars per chain of market cap, where it's still interesting for validators to participate in this network. And after we figure out that there are models where validators will validate chain and support it, even though they will not get any reward. So even though this will be not profitable for them, they will support this network because there are other economic incentives. For example, they can get some transaction fees from this network without getting any coins created. And I think that new small networks within the ecosystem of Ethereum or Polkadot or Cosmos can bring new economic models, and we will see that okay, there are some networks operated by oligarchy, and will be more than planned, so it came over. And will be thank you. For sure will be networks where we will see more democratic approaches and interesting models with zero emission or negative emission, and these models are viable, and we can see it on our example, and we see that people are building the same models.
Yeah. This works. Great. I think there are certainly problems with the one head, one vote method. But like on the other side, I think that there will also be problems with the capital essentially rules the world. Because I try to reason think about in Germany, a certain amount of money in your bank account translates into a certain amount of political influence essentially. In the US, that amount of influence for the same amount of money is likely going to be much, much greater. And in purely stake-weighted systems, that is essentially a one-to-one mapping. And so personally, I think that, for example, the German governance system is doing reasonably better than the American governance system. So I think my main point is there will be a spectrum of things, and the entire point of the coming probably 2 to 4 years is to experiment with every possible governance system, because by building the underlying tools, we make it extremely easy for people and very cheap to experiment with different governance structures and different governance models, and hopefully we arrive at something that is better than the current systems that we have.
Nice. Okay. Does anybody want to ask a question to the panel?
Questions?
Questions from the audience?
Yeah, there are lots of questions.
Hello, I'm Federico from Cosmos. So one important concept in governance is the default values. So maybe you could define some default value for your parameters change or for your software updates, for example. So how do you decide on each of your networks the default parameters?
You mean at launch, or when you do a governance proposal, there will be default values?
Yeah, I mean, like for example, yeah, in Cosmos case, not much, but in others, that not necessarily applies.
Yeah, I mean, so the way I think the goal for how you want to pick these values is like pick a reasonable default. It's like pick nothing that like tends to the either extreme, like pick something that you think is going to be stable enough for like 6 months, so that within the next 6 months people can experiment and figure out whether those values are actually not that stable and they need to be changed, or whether we can continue on. Like you made this point earlier that you think that governance systems will be very stable. I think we've never, for a while, my perspective is it will take a while for governance. It will take a long while for governance systems to start being stable, because there's a lot of untested things we don't know about them yet, and it's going to be very exciting to test them all out.
Yeah, it's a good question. For Polkadot, I thought of exactly this. Like, even as far as not just the default values, but even as far as the default governance system. Like, what governance system does it even start with? And the answer is, well, let's do like an alpha and a beta, right? So let's not like bet the farm on the very first version, because that's a bit silly. But the problem is that if you don't bet something on it, you're not going to get an effective indication of how it will work when you do bet the farm on it. So we came up with an idea of like a value-bearing testnet, which is kind of like a testnet, except the tokens on it are kind of cheap but still have value. And the idea with this is that we can run this for like 6 months or 12 months just to see what kind of governance systems work, how people behave when real money is at stake, what sort of parameters work. Is a 2-week referendum period reasonable? 4 weeks, 1 week, 3 days? We don't know, but let's try and let's see how many people turn out to vote. Also voter turnout. Also, is a council. Is there this idea of like a Congress, an overseeing Congress? Is that a thing? Does anyone actually want to be a part of it? Is anyone going to put any effort into advertising their candidacy? We don't know, and it's worth actually figuring that out on a network that is worth something, but just not very much.
So in Tezos, the way it was decided, so we launched with a beta net, so we intentionally set all the constants like pretty conservatively. So and this is one of the cool things about doing things, having a modular design, which is that you can set the parameters pretty conservatively and then incrementally change them. And then later on in the governance model, we'll have to figure out how to get a lot of people to pass the quorum to do things super incrementally, but. In the initial terms, so we don't have governance for 6 months. The core devs from the original team, basically they set the block time at 1 minute. But we've already talked. There's been lots of talk already internally. Looking at different testing of like different block time that's significantly lower than that, different blocks, size, like all sorts of things like this. And the plan is to start in a way that does not disrupt the instability, doesn't cause the network to become unstable or to have a lot of empty blocks or anything like that, right? But then another interesting dimension that we've encountered is that there's certain constants that you create that might be very susceptible to the voters trying to change. So, for example, bonds, or security deposits and safety deposits in Tezos. So in Tezos proof of stake, you, in order to bake a block, we call staking baking in Tezos. We call the block creation baking because it's a French project, and basically. We set the security deposits that you need, like similar to Ethereum slasher model or these sorts of things. You have to put up a security deposit that can be slashed if you start baking blocks on a second chain. Explicitly try to start double signing blocks or double baking blocks. And basically, what happens? One of the things we thought about is the fact that if we set it too high, then people who want to become validators. Will maybe they'll want to sort of influence the bond size so they can participate more in baking and get bigger rewards or something like that. So we intentionally set it it was intentionally set at a level where it would be less susceptible to it was sort of modeled and thought out and you sort of set it at an initial level that would be be able to avoid sort of some kind of manipulation that would undermine the security of the network long term.
So perhaps opening again off. So I think that using best judgment, how you can define these values, guess more or less, right? Try and come up with something that you think is reasonable. Try and make sure nobody else that knows something about what it is you're trying to do thinks it's ridiculous, but not overthink it too much, because it's probably going to be wrong whatever you decide. So that's where it's important to have the ability to change it when you actually have some more real data about what it ought to be. I think too much effort can go into thinking about what the specific should be up front.
Yeah, I think these parameters are most about off-chain governance and protocol design. So the best way is define them when you design the protocol, and it's hard to change, right? Especially sensitive parameter is the emission rate, so it's hard to increase it. Well, for me, some parameters like, okay, what is the ideal number of validators, right? And you ask people, and like 20, 25 something, you ask about block times, like 3-5 seconds, and so forth. But some parameters are not obvious. For example, how many coins we should create on pre-mining? And when I asked most founders, they just, okay, create 1 billion coins, right? Or 100 millions, and they didn't have an answer. So I just want to explain my thought process when I decided how many coins we should create for a POA network. So we started from one block, create 1 coin, right? And in a year, it's about 6 million something coins if you have 5 seconds block time. And this is a reward for validators, and reward for validators 2.5% of year emission. So we know emission, this total supply, this is 250 something million coins. That's how we figure out pre-mining thing. Start to think, oh, that's a number, and we can explain why it's 250 million coins and not billion coins. So that's those parameters should be defined on specification the best way. So it's a form of off-chain governance. But some parameters can be modified by on-chain governance. For example, if you decrease block time, but you have the same emission, which you can make in the latest version of Parity with new functionality called block reward. You can define a reward within smart contracts and change block time and keep the same emission rate. So you can upgrade the protocol. You say, okay, guys, validators will upgrade their hardware. They will keep more data on-chain data, but emission will stay the same, and the protocol will be better. And that can be decided by on-chain governance. But some things like, okay, let's increase emission because the price of token went down. This type of decisions will be hard to make on-chain, so that they should be designed within the off-chain process.
Actually, I'd just like to maybe highlight this point. I totally want to second Gavin's point on this. Running testnets is an amazing idea because it allows you to gather a ton of data on what the actual parameters are. And I think generally for most applications that you want to deploy, you should find ways to be able to test them in as real of a setting as can be, because it will teach you a lot about not only the process of deploying it, but also how they behave once they're deployed.
Hey, we've talked about one person, one vote, and also the equivalent to your money at stake. How about reputation-based voting? Has anybody tested around with that?
That is basically that's a huge part of Colony. It's all about decisions being weighted, well, not so much decisions, but influence, authority over how things get done is weighted by reputation. And that reputation is derived by having demonstrated that you have expertise in the context of that organization for whatever that skill is, and whatever the context within the organization is. So, yeah, that's our thing.
Yeah, so in Tezos we haven't looked at that really, but we were talking about it earlier today, and some aspects of it were pretty interesting for, on the core protocol side. We actually, there's sort of an implicit reputation or, way of evaluating, sort of trying to improve the quality of the decision makers set. Like in Tezos, so in Tezos, the people the developers who propose an upgrade are able to invoice the network when they when they put the proposal on a testnet. They sort of say, oh, here's the invoice that I would want to be paid. This is what it would cost. If you promote it to mainnet, and maybe you have it as a vesting contract of some kind, and they get it over time, whatever. But if you think about what that does long term, it actually causes the network to, when it inflates, so it does this with inflation. What it's doing is it's actually creating a feedback loop that improves the quality of the decision maker set, because it's continuously rewarding people who are improving the network. So this is something that, and also I think reputation systems are actually interesting to implement, especially on layer 2. I'm a little more conservative about layer 1, but I think that we should, when you're designing a governance system, you should think about like whether or not you're rewarding the right stakeholders with your, if you're using some kind of budget or invoicing system, like how are you rewarding people? What's the feedback loop look like when you move tokens to a given account by inflation or whatnot?
Yeah, so I mean, I would probably agree with you that, for layer 1, reputation systems might be a bit overkill, and you do risk by implementing them there. I mean, they're relatively, sort of complex, subtle things, and having them at that level is not necessarily, like right next to the consensus and staking mechanism, not necessarily what you want. But it's also, I think it's a fair point that reputation systems are not like tremendously well defined. There are many different ways that you might kind of determine that someone has some reputation. Maybe it's because they've got a lot of Twitter followers. Maybe it's because they've got a few Twitter followers, but those Twitter followers have a lot of Twitter followers. Maybe it's because they've been around in an ecosystem for a long time and generally haven't done anything wrong. Maybe they're just popularly known. And if we sort of expand the idea of, well, people of well repute maybe get a bonus for their opinion, then we might be able to sort of introduce a really basic reputation system, which is that, hey, look, if they've been helping maintain this network, which we assume has been going reasonably well for a sufficiently long time, then we can consider them, people of relatively high reputation for this relatively low-level definition of reputation. And that's definitely something that we're looking into with Polkadot.
Yeah, so POA network is based on reputation of individual validators. So we delegated this process to on state level. So all our validators required to have US public notary license, which guarantee that they don't have criminal record in past, and they're publicly identified, and anyone can challenge their identity. So we used oracleized identity, which is a part of the process of onboarding of new validators. And we think this is a great way of reputation for people who basically hold our funds, right, and make computations for us. So we know that they're not criminal, they're fingerprinted, KYC'd, and they're in good standing with their state, and we know where they reside. So it's a one form of reputation, and also they're all in the same jurisdiction, which is also protect token holders from collusion of validators, because US punishment system is well known for that it's working, right? Well, there are some concerns about all validators in the same jurisdiction. The jurisdiction is the US, but notary law regulated by state, and there is no federal notary organization who can regulate them. And this is one solution we can provide. Also, we built some oracles to prove independent part of their identity. So we have proof of physical address for validators, oracleize their physical address, and then proof of bank account where they can log into their bank account. And this independent oracle can prove that they logged into their bank account, and this information oracleized and also tokenized and connected to their mining team, so you can prove that this validator passed this verification. Also, you can challenge him. You can ask, can you prove that you can log in into your bank account, or that you can get this postcard in your mailbox, which is the same mailbox as registered for you as a notary. And when you register as a notary, you give oath, and if you lie, it's a perjury. It's 5 years in federal prison in the US. So that's a way how we reuse the existing law system to guarantee reputation of validators of your network. And that's very scalable because there are 3.5 million of public notaries in the US.
Okay, we are running out of time very quickly, so we have time for one more question. It would be great if we could have maybe just one or two people respond, if that's okay.
Hey, so you mentioned just before that like you're going to test on-chain governance on testnets, but how can you actually guarantee that people will act in any way like they would in real life on like non-value holding testnet? Because these are really important decisions. Like, isn't it actually the
Yes.
you need something at stake for real for people to act correctly?
To fully test the system, I agree that you need something at stake, which is why having like low stakes testnets is potentially an extremely powerful way to actually, especially test things like on-chain governance and how the voting process works and whether people actually care about the system at all. I think to test, what I was referring to was more like basic, more fundamental parameters like block times, slashing periods, downtime required, like how long you can be offline before you become unbonded as a validator. More the parts related to the consensus and like maintaining a stable consensus system. And those, I believe that you don't necessarily need anything at stake because the early adopters that you have will, like, there's a clear path to why this helps the future of the network to test this out when there's nothing at stake. And there's a lot of people that are motivated enough to participate even if it's just a testnet. But if you're planning to like be an active participant in this ecosystem for the next 2 years, a lot of people have a lot of motivation to make sure that nothing gets launched that is fundamentally broken. So like testing these basic things like block times, you don't need incentivized testnets. Maybe for like actively attack, so like to test the security of other validators and like actually, so beyond even just simply having a valuable token, there's like other ways that the organizations that launch these networks can actually incentivize people. So like you can incentivize certain behavior. There are all sorts of ways to get incentivized testnets.
Yeah, just make the token worth something.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that before. That's actually a really cool idea. I like that a lot. It's for something like Colony, it's quite hard to question. It's very questionable how valuable a testnet really is because it's all based on game theory. So the game theory really doesn't work if there's no value.
So I heard of people actually buying Bitcoin testnet bitcoins because people started hoarding them.
That's not a testnet anymore.
Collector's item.
It is a testnet.
Some people will buy Cohen coins. Yeah, sure.
There's an active market for Cohen coins.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I heard someone paid like 10,000 dot testnet tokens for a pizza actually.
That's the case our government systems will do.
We embedded the participation in testnet into our on-chain governance for validators. So one requirement to be a validator on core network is to participate as a validator on testnet for at least a month and participate for at least one governance event. So you have to add another validator or remove validator from the network before you will be onboarded on the core network. So it's a form of onboarding process, like educational process.
Yeah, I just have something quick to add. So in Tezos, actually, the protocol is written in a functional programming language, and functional programming really allows you to do formal proofs very much more easily than different other programming languages and types. And you can. And one cool thing is that when you run a testnet, Tezos will eventually we're going to